The Digital Science Speaker Series is an opportunity for us to meet and have conversations with people that are advocating for different and often better ways of doing research. Today's guest is no exception. Dr. Niamh O'Connor is a chemist, a sci fi book nerd, and chief publishing officer at PLOS. Niamh, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to get to chat to you. Now, I wonder, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
I can. It's a pleasure to be here too. I'm from Cork in Ireland. I now live in Berlin. I studied chemistry and did a PhD in organometallic chemistry. And while I absolutely loved chemistry, I kind of realized while I was in the lab that I wanted to do something else, like rather than kind of research. So I was looking for different things you could do that would still keep close to the science, but be a bit different. And came across the Royal Society of Chemistry's graduate training program that they had just started that year. So I applied for that, kind of thinking, this will be a good experience if I get an interview kind of thing. So joined their graduate training program and then stayed working there for 9 years. It was a science publishing program, and then worked for the Biochemical Society. And then I joined PLOS 5 years ago and have been in Berlin for the last 2 of those.
Oh, wow. I, too, am a chemist, as you know, and
Yes.
I no longer work in academia or research either. I do find people find their way into these sort of alternative academic or academic adjacent careers, but often not really realizing that they're out there or how fundamental they are to supporting the research that goes on. And it's hugely important, isn't it? Do you think we need to do more about showcasing the range of careers that do support research?
Yes, I do. And I think it's really important to recognize that everything the whole research ecosystem needs people who have different interests and who contribute in different ways. And sometimes I think that the fact that people sometimes feel that one of those is more valuable than others, or that some are more valuable than others, does everyone a disservice. So that people get stuck feeling that they have to stay in careers they don't enjoy, or find it very difficult to find information about kind of wider careers. I think that is something where, at least in the UK, like having experience of working for learned societies, that I think they are really trying, to showcase different careers, and that often really kind of go and make connections. But I know when I was a student, allowing that was a long time ago now, it seemed really difficult to work out what options there were, that weren't working in a pharma company, which is what most people did. When I was doing my PhD. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it kind of starts in school often as well, doesn't it? Because if you choose certain subjects, you're sort of destined to do one of 3 careers that are available to you, and it sort of propagates. And we don't really have much of that support, I think, at least, when I was back at university in higher education. So I did this. I went on a grad scheme. I was training to be an actuary. And then I found my way back to science because I missed it so much. I missed the chemistry. So you have thankfully found your way to PLOS, where you are chief publishing officer. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about PLOS? What is PLOS all about? What is its mission, and how does it serve the research community?
Yeah, sure. So PLOS started about 22 years ago now. Initially, to as an advocacy organization, really to address the fact that loads of money was being spent on subscriptions, that people weren't able to access the research that was being published, and that there was a real sense that because public money was funding the research, that this really should be there for the public good and people should be able to access that. And the PLOS founders went out and kind of really advocated and kind of got community support to get some funding to start an organization. And I think then through initially working on that, realizing that if you're really going to make the change real, you also have to participate. And so PLOS Biology was PLOS's first journal. The intention initially being change one parameter. So really like scientific experiment, keep the other features the same as can people recognize in journals, but make the research open and make it possible for everybody to read. And I think that kind of really acting as a catalyst for change has always been central to what PLOS does, but also thinking about the experiments that can have really meaningful impact. So kind of moving on to the, like, say, PLOS medicine, where there was a real need, you know, particularly in a US context, where you think about how much, you know, people are not able to access information about their own treatment, or about kind of, you know, how that is really only available for people in kind of medical schools or doctors who are associated with medical schools. And then, of course, PLOS One really changing things like the parameters for how we publish. So that's always been our aim, to find kind of what the next thing is, where we need to remove one of the barriers and then kind of keep pushing. So currently, I think we've really been thinking about the fact that open access, happily, is now relatively mainstream. Doesn't mean that everything is sorted, because like there's definitely more to do. But I think, you know, the kind of discussion and kind of the conversation that's happening in kind of the research ecosystem is now very much about open science. And so, you know, I think there are a whole variety of parts of that are really interesting. But I think the two things that spring to mind for me are, if you're going to change a system, then you have to think about, like, where were the inequities in the previous system, and what can you do to try to address some of those. And so I think one of the things, you know, we do some work with UNESCO, and one of the things that kind of I find really interesting as an observation on their part is that you know, there has been some lecturing people about what they should be doing, and really understanding that the barriers for different communities, for people in their cultural context, is different, in different regions is different. And even talking about science and medicine, where we think of those as the same everywhere, the way that people do their science is so different depending on the political context in which they work, you know, the geography in which they work. And so kind of thinking about how we can really, you know, engage with communities, work more closely with people to remove the barriers for them in moving to open is super important. And I think the other thing is really thinking about how we can move away from the legacy of print. Because even though, I mean, I think PLOS, maybe there were a couple of print copies of PLOS Biology originally, but basically everything's always been online. But so much of kind of the whole research, assessment and sharing system is still based on a print model. And that's something that we really have to think about changing if we want to really move towards open science.
It seems just so wild when we think about it now, but when people started to publish scientific knowledge, you know, evidence and results of the experiments that they'd conducted, they did it with the purpose of sharing that knowledge so other people could build on it. And of course, to kind of, you know, put their stake in the ground and say, this is something that I've done here. You know, I'm putting this out there now. This is mine. We then moved to this whole industry of actually really closing things off. And it does seem just so strange and so counterproductive to research and development and innovation. So I suppose, you know, the thing that you talked about, inequity, the people that created the system, that created the rules, it's really persisted, but they were not really representative of society and of the kind of research workforce that we would like to be seeing that reflects society. So what is being done, do you think, to try and change that, to try and change the rules, to try and have better representation up at the top?
I think there are a lot of efforts to do that. They vary a lot by region. So I will say there are regions that are much further along that journey than others. And of course, it means different things in different places. But I think we haven't come anything close to kind of the distance we should. And very often it kind of seems like there's a certain amount of difference or a certain amount of representation or a certain amount of diversity that's okay. But then people kind of pull back a little bit and go, oh, maybe that's a bit too much diversity. So I think the place that I guess feel most qualified to comment in a way is around what I see in an academic publishing. One of the things that I was very struck by relatively early, kind of in my publishing career when I was an editor, was how often people said to me, so I was extremely lucky that I had the opportunity to actually travel to both conferences and to universities, like in different countries, and see how people did their research and hear about the challenges that they had. And how often people commented on whether or not they felt their community or they were represented. And it wasn't, I want to be on your board, but it was, there's nobody like me. I don't see myself when I look at that group. Therefore, I feel my research isn't welcome. And I think that, for me at least, like really struck home in how important it is for people to see that they're, it's not enough to say to somebody, you're welcome here. You have to actually show that. And there have to be people who can, to some extent, allowing that you can't represent like every person. But there have to be people that people feel are going to be able to connect with them or understand the challenges they have. And I think within academic publishing itself, there is a massive challenge because the academic publishing workforce is not very diverse. And there is an area there where like a lot of work has been going into to try to change that, but it's very, very slow. It's very slow. And some of that is because there are not enough people of color who have the opportunity to study science and kind of actually coming through. And, even before you get to the point of potentially working in academic publishing, there are so many systemic barriers. But it used to be the case that there were very few women in leadership roles. And I really hope that we will continue to see that change and really see a properly more diverse workforce. Because if you don't see it at the publishers, then the chances of actually being able to make that change in terms of what we publish is really small.
So I do think it's important that we do celebrate how far we have come, because we've definitely made some progress in having a more representative research workforce and representation at leadership level as well. But I certainly see the point about board level appointments and things. I'm a trustee of a charity, and I think it's really quite obvious that I'm maybe not like a lot of the other trustees in many different ways, but that's why it's important. And even though sometimes it can be a little bit challenging putting yourself out there, if people do see somebody like them on a board, maybe they'll go, well, there is a place for our voices, and maybe I'll put myself forward and maybe I bring something else. I do think, though, that what you say about inequality being this systemic issue is so true, because I think the people that do stay on in these academic adjacent or alternative academic careers have had the opportunity to do research in the first place. And I think access to that is still quite skewed towards people that have, financial cushions and the sort of socioeconomic background that can support not having a proper job for 4 years while you do a PhD and stuff. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there for sure. But good things are happening. And we can't get disheartened. The culture change is really hard. It's really hard.
So two things that occurred to me just as you say that, and this is a UK specific comment, because my experience largely of kind of initiatives for encouraging people into science, and encouraging people from a wider variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, and with initiatives like there's a group called Into Science, or the kind of things that, again, societies or, really do to try to encourage people to see that science can be for them is difficult. And, as we were just chatting a few minutes ago and thinking, like, there's a woman who came to speak to us at PLOS, Elaine Westbrooks, who I apologize because I won't get her title quite right, but I think is the library director at Cornell now. And, one of the questions that one of my colleagues asked her was, like, she was talking to us about issues of, diversity and equity and inclusion. And one of my colleagues was saying to her, when it's so difficult, how do you keep up kind of, how do you keep the energy to keep doing this? And, I found her answer really helpful, which was, you just think of the things that you can work towards changing. And every change that you make is valid. So I think it is that, and kind of not to lose faith because it's slower than sometimes we might like.
Yeah.
But just to kind of keep going and do what we can, and hope that we are kind of working in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So speaking of moving in the right direction, we've spoken a little bit about open science and open research and how it's really hard to see any downsides to it. There is a real push towards this way of sharing scholarly publishing and communications. There are government mandates that encourage and support this. I went to UCL for most of my degrees. They were one of the early proponents for open science. They've continued to do that. Every research excellence framework submission they've deemed must be available as open access, and that's such a positive thing.
Yeah.
But we're not all on board with this, are we? So where in your experience is the most reluctance? Who isn't part of the conversation at the moment, and how do you think we can encourage them? Are there risks that they're particularly concerned about, do you think?
I think it's the same as, when we're talking about kind of making any kind of change is always difficult, and people tend to be a little uneasy.
Yeah.
So I think there are two different aspects, I mean, more than two, but two main that occur to me aspects to this. One is the incentive system really stops people who do want to change being able to make that choice a lot of the time. Researcher assessment reform is such a big deal and a real requirement for this. And one of the things that happens a lot is that everyone's unwilling to move until somebody else moves first. So, what happens a lot, say in publishing, is that people say, well, our role is to serve the needs of the researchers. So, as long as what researchers want is this traditional thing that we've always had, then we have to keep doing that because that's what researchers want and what they need. And of course, funders have a slightly different position and can sometimes mandate things, but at the same time, they do want to be able to fund research, to have people be able to continue the work that they're doing. And so, and the same with kind of universities and libraries, and everybody is slightly caught in the system.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we really try to do at PLOS is to show that you can make changes. And so you look at the different places where there are barriers and think about, well, how can I just move enough to show that it's possible? And so, my colleague, Ravina Anand, is leading some work we're doing at the moment with Coalition S and GISC, and also then with a range of kind of stakeholders to really look at how we can, for example, look at non-article based business models, take out that kind of, per article payment system, which you really need to change. So I think that's part of it. We really have to think about how we can change those incentives, surface more different kinds of research outputs so that there is the opportunity to see a greater range of people's actual research, that people are not feeling the need to produce everything as an article. So I do think that's a huge issue. And then also there are parts that are about behavior change, and that's always, somewhere that there's a mixture, right, of incentivizing people, also mandating. And for anyone who's interested in kind of looking at more about that, the Center for Open Science in the States has some really nice descriptions of that I know I wouldn't do justice to. So I'm just going to say, go and have a look at what they've got. But I do think that's really important. And some of people's concerns are like really valid, right? So, if you have been brought up in a system where what you're told all the time is, this is my research, it's my research, I own this, and I did this, and it's really important that it's mine, right? Rather than thinking about, this is something I contributed to, and of course I should be credited for my contribution, but it's something that's a shared resource for everybody. And that's just a completely different way of thinking about it. And I understand that that's, I have to make that shift. So, I think that's the same for other people. And I also think there are some really specific kind of very, very valid concerns that come up for communities who are used to having their kind of knowledge taken advantage of, whether that's Indigenous communities, or whether it's people who are coming from lower income kind of countries where there hasn't been the same opportunity, and where there's a massive power imbalance and people perceive massive power imbalances, and really feeling that, well, if I just put things out there, how am I going to be taken advantage of this time? And so I think it's really important that there are mechanisms to show that people do get credit, that it's not about one group disadvantaging another group, that it is about equity and being able to share research as well as to read it and actually being part of that conversation. And so I think those are, issues that will keep us busy for a while, but really worthwhile.
It's interesting the way that we reward individual academic success and the way that we measure research success generally is just not conducive to actually serving the most people, or I feel like people really lose focus in terms of why they're researching what they're researching in the first place, ultimately hopefully to have a positive benefit on society, a positive impact. But I think the culture within which we work pushes you to forget that quite quickly because the way you're being measured is really different. It's really tricky. So we've talked a lot about, wrangling this sort of global publishing culture, the way that we share information. And we also talk a lot, it's very zeitgeisty, about how technology can help.
Yep.
So how can technology help move this forward? How can tech support an open research agenda for all?
I think technology is absolutely central to being able to do that. I think that one of the things that happens a lot is that we constantly try to make the digital world into a version of the analog one, by kind of not asking the right questions or not inviting the right people to the table to be part of the conversation. And I think if we really want to think differently, and if you were starting now, right, and thinking about how would you want a system of kind of research assessment, and I don't mean researcher assessment, I mean actually looking at quality control, of things like peer review, of how we share research, how we find things. Would it look anything like what we have now? I mean, probably no, right? So I think there is a really long way to go, and we're really only at the beginning of exploring what that might look like. And so I think it's extremely important to think about things like, I think it's really interesting. It's something we've been thinking about, but I know others have too, around if you don't any longer use the version of record of an article as the fixed thing, because it's a weird fixed thing to have in a digital context. That is 100% a thing that is print. And, in a print context, that kind of makes sense, but makes no sense for a digital context. So you've got to think about something else. And you have to think about, well, like, why do we not version information? Well, we don't version information because when you were posting out copies of journals to people, you couldn't really do that in a meaningful way. So you have to have, corrections that were separate publications. But you don't need to do that in a digital format. You just have to make sure that you are able to have a record of your versions so that, like, which one is the latest authoritative version. But you don't have to, that doesn't have to be fixed because nothing else is fixed in that kind of way. And it doesn't mean that we're moving away or kind of losing, the ability to say, this is the one that is representing the current best knowledge. But I think there are different ways to do that. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see the different ways in which technology continues to make a difference to that, because it has done so much already.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think the version of record conversation is one where you feel that by having a system that allows for that, you're maybe boosting the integrity of that research. To have the most up-to-date version of that research should be a really positive thing. But there is that reluctance to adopt that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's back to incentives. I mean, it's baked into so many people's business models. Like, there is, I think, an understandable kind of double take people do around thinking, oh, is that just that mean there's just going to be lots of versions and I won't know which one it is? And of course, that's not what it means. But it is a really different way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to take a step back for a moment. Given that you play such an integral role in the research ecosystem, how it all happens, how we can encourage progress and catalyze, more innovation, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the research community at the moment?
I mean, I know this is kind of repeating something that I said, but I think really being able to change the incentive systems in which people are caught is probably the biggest challenge. I also can totally understand that for people who get into wanting to kind of be researchers and, study or kind of explore different things, discover new knowledge or teach or whichever aspect really, really engages them, that's not really why they got into it mostly. Like unless your area of research is incentive systems, that's probably not the reason that you became a researcher. But I think they just have so much impact and really do result in people getting, being caught in ways and in, like you were referencing, having to do things because that's the system you're in. So I think to make real change, that's a huge, huge challenge. I think there are so many people with fabulous ideas out there and exciting things to research. I will also say, like speaking as a publisher, I think, and again, kind of, I have colleagues much more knowledgeable about this than me, but I think the issue of research integrity is one that we also will need to be continuing to pay a lot of attention to, and also one where I think technology and data science are going to have huge contributions to make in thinking about what it really means to be able to, show people that research is trustworthy, to have those signals of trust that people can believe what they read or can believe what the text and data mining kind of that they do, the results they see. So I think that is something that's really important as well.
Yeah, I think the fair data conversations alongside open research, as well as the research integrity conversations, these markers of trust, these trust markers like data availability statements and things like that, at least they can reassure somebody either at the point of publication or just before publication, or if they're going to build on somebody's work, it really is such an important thing. But in this age of kind of misinformation, disinformation, this erosion of trust, I think it's an amazing way that tech can help, especially given the volume of research that we're wrangling at the moment.
And also, just hearing so many things where actually you need that, and you need to be able to see patterns, and you need to be able to see what's happening, and technology is hugely important in supporting that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, my last question is going to be, if you could change one thing that would really boost the future of research to benefit as many people as possible, what would it be?
Wow, that's a really good question. So, my answer is going to show my bias. I would kill the version of record. It's because the thing I'd really like to do anyway. And I connect that to kind of inclusion because I actually think that giving more weight to a greater diversity of research outputs will help people to kind of feel that research is more inclusive for them, take away quite such a lot of emphasis in learning to write in a particular style, and really enable people to kind of share the research in a way that's most useful for them. And I think that would be really fantastic. Yeah.
I will never understand why research is written in such an obfuscatory manner. I find it entirely counterintuitive to communicating things that people do, and I will double down on that one with you. Absolutely. It's a real bugbear of mine.
Yeah, it's just, it's the convention, right? And then we all have to do it because it's for convention. So yeah, all for killing a few conventions.
Smash convention.
Exactly.
Niamh, thank you so much for giving up your time to chat with us today. It's been brilliant and inspiring, and I'm all for all the things that you are supporting. Thank you.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.